There's a word sitting in the middle of Psalm 46 that most people have read their entire lives and never actually read. Not really. They've said it out loud. They've had it printed on coffee mugs and painted on the walls of their living rooms. They've whispered it to themselves in hospital waiting rooms and in the dark hours before dawn, when everything feels like it's coming apart. They know the sound of it. But the word itself, the actual word the poet wrote, in the language the poet was thinking in when he wrote it, means something so different from what most of us have been carrying that when you finally see it, something shifts. Something you didn't even know you were holding on to just quietly lets go. That's where I want to start. Not with the verse as you know it, with the word you've never actually met. The verse is Psalm 46, verse 10. You know how it goes. Be still and know that I am God. 6 words in English. Simple. Clean. The kind of sentence that looks like it was made to be engraved in stone. And for centuries, across traditions, across languages, across cultures, that phrase has carried an enormous amount of weight. People have built entire theologies of contemplative prayer around it. Entire spiritual disciplines. The idea that God is asking us to get quiet, to sit down, to stop moving, to breathe, to center ourselves, to find some inner stillness in the middle of the noise of life. And that reading isn't wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that changes everything. Because the Hebrew word translated as be still isn't a word about silence. It isn't a word about breathing. It isn't a word about sitting down and closing your eyes and finding your center. The word is Rapha, and Rapha means to drop something, to let something fall from your hands, to sink down, to release, to go slack. In some places in the Hebrew scriptures, it describes the moment when a man's hands fall limp at his sides because he has no more strength to fight. In other places, it describes letting go of something you've been gripping so tightly that your knuckles have gone white. The word has a texture to it, a physicality. It isn't be still like a pond at sunrise. It's be still like a soldier who finally drops his sword. And when you understand that, the verse stops being a gentle invitation to a quieter life. It becomes something much more specific, much more urgent, much more demanding, actually. Because God isn't asking you to sit in silence. He's asking you to let go of something you've been fighting to hold on to. And the question that opens up right there, the question that stays open through this entire psalm and won't close until we get to the end, is what exactly are we supposed to be letting go of? Stay with me here, because the answer is in the psalm, but you have to know what was happening when the psalm was written to feel the full weight of it. The psalms were not written in a vacuum. They were written by people who were living through specific things, specific fears, specific catastrophes, specific moments of impossible pressure, and who found in those moments that the only thing left to do was to speak to God out of the rawness of exactly where they were. Psalm 46 has a heading in the Hebrew text, one of those little notes at the top that most modern readers skip right over. It says it's a psalm of the sons of Korah, and it's designated as a song for Alamot, which some scholars understand as a musical term, possibly referring to the voices of young women, a choir singing something in the upper registers. And then it says it's a maskil, a word that sometimes means a song of wisdom or instruction. So right away we're in the world of the temple, the world of worship, the world of something being sung aloud in a community, not just written to be read privately. The sons of Korah. Let's sit with that for a moment, because that name carries its own weight, its own story that runs underneath this psalm like a current beneath still water. Korah was a Levite, a man of the tribe entrusted with the care of the sanctuary and the worship of Israel, who led a rebellion against Moses in the wilderness. The story is in Numbers 16, and it ends terribly. The earth opens up and swallows Korah and his household, and all those who stood with him in the revolt. It's one of the most dramatic moments of judgment in the entire Torah, and it left a mark on the memory of Israel that never fully faded. But here's the thing that people often miss. Numbers 26 records something quietly, almost as a footnote. The sons of Korah did not die. The children of the man who led that rebellion were spared. They survived. And in the generations that followed, they became some of the most important musicians and composers in the entire life of the temple. 11 psalms in the book of Psalms bear their name: Psalm 46, 47, 48, and more. These men, the descendants of a rebel, became the voices of Israel's deepest worship. There's already something in that, something about the grace that runs through this text, even before we read a single line of it. The family of a man who challenged God's appointed order, who reached for something that wasn't his and lost everything, and the children of that man became the ones who sang, "Lord God Almighty. The God of Jacob is our fortress." The poetry of reversal in the Bible runs deep. But back to Psalm 46 itself, because while we can't be completely certain of the historical moment that gave birth to it, many scholars, and I think they're right to look in this direction, have pointed to the Assyrian crisis as the most likely context. And when you place the psalm in that world, it comes alive in a way that's almost impossible to describe. The Assyrian Empire in the 8th century before the Common Era was not simply a powerful nation. It was a machine. It was the most sophisticated military force the ancient world had ever produced. The Assyrians had developed siege warfare into something approaching a science. They had armored cavalry, iron-tipped arrows, massive battering rams mounted on wheeled towers, armies that could strip a city bare and leave its population as footnotes in an inscription. Their own records, carved in stone and now housed in museums in London and elsewhere, describe what they did to the cities that stood against them in language that is almost too brutal to read. They didn't just defeat their enemies. They made examples of them. They were methodical about it. And by the late 8th century, they had already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, scattered the 10 tribes, and turned their attention south toward Jerusalem. Under the Assyrian king Sennacherib, that pressure reached its peak. The year was around 701 before the Common Era. Sennacherib had already moved through Judah, taking city after city. His own annals claim he captured 46 fortified cities in Judah and took over 200,000 people captive. Those are his numbers and should be read with appropriate skepticism. But even allowing for the exaggeration that was standard in ancient royal propaganda, the scale of the devastation was real. He had Hezekiah, the king of Jerusalem, shut up like, as his inscription puts it, a bird in a cage. Jerusalem was surrounded. 46 cities of Judah gone, the countryside stripped, and now the capital itself, the city where the temple stood, the city where the name of God dwelled, was staring down at the Assyrian camps on its walls. The book of 2 Kings records what Sennacherib's field commander, a man called the Rabshakeh, said outside the walls of Jerusalem, while the residents could hear every word from the ramparts. He spoke in Hebrew on purpose. He wanted the people to understand. He told them their king couldn't save them. He told them their God couldn't save them. He asked them which god of any nation had ever managed to stop Assyria. He made the case, out loud, in the language of the people he was threatening, that trust in the God of Israel was foolishness, that surrender was the only rational option. And the people stood on the walls and said nothing. The text says Hezekiah had commanded them not to answer. Just silence, just the sound of the wind and the distant movement of the Assyrian camp below. Now, Read Psalm 46 in that world. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling. That's not a metaphor about a bad week. That is a poem written by people who could see the enemy camp from their walls, the earth giving way, the mountains falling into the sea. These are images of total cosmic dissolution, the kind of language you reach for when everything you have built your life on feels like it's crumbling. The sons of Korah, or the tradition they represented, reached for the most extreme language available because the situation called for it. And right into the middle of that extreme situation, they placed this declaration: "We will not fear." Not because there's nothing to fear, but because of where we're standing when we say it. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. The Most High dwells in Jerusalem, in Zion, in the place where the temple stands. And because of that, the text says, God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. She shall not be moved. When the dawn comes, God will help her. Now here's something worth pausing on. The city shall not be moved. In Hebrew, the word there is mot, to be shaken, to slip, to lose footing. The mountains tremble, the waters roar, but the city does not slip. And the scholars who have looked at this closely note that the dawn isn't just a poetic image here. In the ancient world, the dawn was the time of battle. Armies attacked at first light. So when the psalmist says, "When the dawn comes, God will help her," he's placing God's intervention at the exact moment when military danger was greatest, not in the quiet of the night, not in the abstract future. At dawn, when the trumpets sound and the rams come up against the gates, the nations raged, the kingdoms were moved, he uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge. That title, the Lord of hosts, deserves its own moment. In Hebrew, it's Yahweh Tsevaot, and the word Tsevaot means armies or hosts, assembled forces. So the full name is something like the Lord of armies, the God who commands every force in existence, visible and invisible. And that name shows up twice in Psalm 46, once in verse 7 and once in verse 11, both times as a kind of refrain. The Lord of armies is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. It appears like an anchor, twice holding the poem in place. Placed right where the song might drift toward despair, the refrain pulls it back. The Lord of armies, the one who commands what cannot be counted, is here. Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. And then, right there, after all of that, after the nations raging and the kingdoms shaking, and the Assyrian camp outside the walls, and the Rabshakeh's voice carrying over the ramparts in the language of the people, right in the middle of this declaration of God's sovereign power over every army that has ever assembled, comes verse 10, Rapha, and know that I am God. Drop your hands, let go. Know that I am God. And this is where it gets strange. Or, not strange, maybe the right word is startling, because the command isn't addressed only to Israel. Look at the context of verse 10 carefully. The verse says, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The nations, the plural, the same nations that were raging in verse 6, the same kingdoms that were shaking, the same Assyrian armies outside the gate, the same Rabshakeh who had been so certain, so confident, so loud in his certainty that no God had ever stopped them before. Some readers of this psalm have understood that Rapha, be still, drop your hands, is addressed not just to Israel, but to the nations themselves, to the empires that rage and believe their own power is final. God is saying, to them, let go. You are not what you think you are. My name will be lifted up among the nations, in the earth. And the way that happens is through the same hands that are being told to drop their weapons. I've sat with that for a long time. The idea that God's invitation to stillness, to releasing what you're gripping, goes out even to the people who are the source of the fear, even to the empire, not because they deserve it, or have earned it, or have asked for it, but because God's purposes are not just local. They're not just for Zion. He will be exalted in all the earth. And the way that happens has something to do with every set of hands, every fist, clenched around a weapon, or an ambition, or a conviction of self-sufficiency, eventually having to open. Now, in the case of Sennacherib and the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, what actually happened next is recorded in both 2 Kings and Isaiah, and it is one of the most astonishing events in the entire history of the ancient Near East. Hezekiah received the Rabshakeh's letter, the written ultimatum from Sennacherib demanding surrender, and he took it to the temple and spread it out before God. He didn't call a war council. He didn't count his remaining soldiers. He went to the temple and laid the letter on the floor and prayed. And the prophet Isaiah sent word back to him, "Do not be afraid." God had heard. And then, in a passage that historians have argued about for centuries, the Assyrian army suffered a massive and sudden catastrophe in the night. The text says, "An angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the people woke at dawn, they were all dead bodies." Sennacherib, who had been so certain, withdrew. He went home to Nineveh and never came back. And years later, according to the text, he was killed by his own sons while he was worshiping in the temple of his God. The historicity of those specific numbers, 185,000 has been debated. Some historians have suggested a plague, others a military withdrawal for political reasons. The Greek historian Herodotus records a tradition of mice swarming the Assyrian camp and destroying their equipment, which has led some to speculate about a disease carried by rodents. The Assyrian records notably are silent about what happened at Jerusalem. There's no victory inscription for this campaign. And an Assyrian silence about a military campaign is, in itself, a kind of testimony. They carved their triumphs everywhere. The absence of a carving speaks. But whatever the mechanism, whatever the specific historical sequence of events, the outcome was that Jerusalem did not fall. The city that the psalm said would not be moved wasn't moved. The dawn came, and the Assyrian camp was gone. And someone, the sons of Korah or whoever carried this song into the temple courts, sang it again, and again. And it went into the collection, and centuries passed, and empires came and went. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and the psalm stayed. And people kept singing the refrain, "The Lord of armies is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." Let's slow down here for a moment, because I want to make sure we don't glide past something that matters. The structure of Psalm 46 is doing something very deliberate, and it's worth looking at closely. The psalm has 3 movements. Though these aren't marked in the text, they emerge from the rhythm and the content. The first movement is verses 1 through 3. God as refuge despite cosmic dissolution. Even if the earth gives way, we are not afraid. The second movement is verses 4 through 7, with the refrain, God present in the city, holding her steady while the nations rage. And the third movement is verses 8 through 11, with the refrain again. Come and see what God has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth, the wars he has ended, and then the command, Rapha, and the declaration, I will be exalted among the nations. The word Selah appears at the end of verse 3 and the end of verse 7. It's one of those musical notations in the Psalms that no one is entirely sure about. The most common traditional reading is that it marks a pause, a moment where the music would swell or go quiet, where the congregation would stop and breathe. Some scholars have connected it to the idea of lifting, an elevation in the music. But whatever its technical meaning, the effect in a text like this is unmistakable. Selah at the end of verse 3, after the image of mountains falling into the sea. Pause there. Let that land. Selah at the end of verse 7, after the refrain that God of armies is with us. Pause there. Feel the weight of that name. The psalm is structured like a piece of music that knows where it needs its silences. That knows where the weight needs to settle before the next thing is said. And then it arrives at verse 10 and says, Rapha. As if the whole psalm has been building to this single word. Drop your hands. Let go. Because look what I have done. Look what I have ended. Look at the weapons I have broken. You were never the one holding this together. You never were. I think about what it must have cost the people of Jerusalem to stand on those walls and say nothing while the Rabshakeh spoke. Hezekiah had told them don't answer. And they didn't. But that silence wasn't passive. It wasn't resignation. It was a choice made in the middle of enormous pressure. The choice to not argue back, to not defend themselves with their own words, to let God be the one who answered. It's the most active kind of stillness, the kind that looks like doing nothing but is actually the hardest thing in the world. Because what you're giving up when you choose that silence is the illusion of control, the sense that if you just say the right thing, if you just respond with enough force or intelligence or argument, you can manage the outcome. And that, I think, is what Rapha is really after. Not the absence of sound, not the practice of sitting quietly in the morning with your tea. Those things aren't bad. They may be genuinely good. But the word is after something deeper, something more specific, something more demanding. It's after the hands, the clenched hands, the hands that are gripping the outcome, gripping the plan, gripping the need to be right, the need to be safe, the need to be in control of what comes next. Those hands. Open them. Now, the question I find myself sitting with, and maybe you find yourself there too, is why that's so hard. Why is that particular act, releasing what you're holding, so much harder than almost any other spiritual practice? And I think the psalm actually answers it. It's hard because the thing you're holding feels real. The Assyrian army was real. The nations raging were real. The walls of Jerusalem had archers on them and siege engines below them. This wasn't a metaphorical threat. And so the invitation to Rapha, to let go, feels like a kind of madness. It feels like being asked to pretend the danger isn't there. But that's not what the psalm does. The psalm doesn't pretend the mountains aren't falling. It says the mountains are falling, and we will not fear. Those are two completely different things. There's a phrase in the New Testament, in the letter to the Philippians, that I think is in direct conversation with this psalm, even though it's separated from it by several centuries. Paul writes, and I'm doing this from memory, and in my own paraphrase, so bear with me. The peace of God that passes all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds. The peace that passes all understanding, not the peace that comes after you figure out the answer. Not the peace that comes once the danger is gone. The peace that passes understanding, that exceeds what can be explained, is the peace that shows up in the middle of the storm. When you can't explain why you're not afraid, and you're not afraid anyway. That peace. Paul says it will stand guard, like a soldier, over your heart and your mind. And you get there, according to what he writes right before that, not by getting the situation under control, but by prayer, by presenting what you're carrying to God, by the kind of releasing that Rapha is after. The sons of Korah knew something about that. Their ancestor had grabbed for something that didn't belong to him, had refused to let go of a rivalry and an ambition, and the earth had opened. And yet here they are, the sons of that man, writing a song about God being a fortress, about letting the mountains fall and choosing not to fear. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes from having watched something go terribly wrong and finding on the other side of it that the ground is still there, that God is still there, that the refrain that has been true for generations is still true even for the family of a rebel. The Lord of armies is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Let me pull on that name for a moment. The God of Jacob, not the God of Abraham, although that title appears elsewhere. Not the God of Moses, although that one appears too. The God of Jacob. And Jacob is, in many ways, the least likely name to appear in this context. Jacob the trickster. Jacob who deceived his blind father to steal his brother's blessing. Jacob who spent a good portion of his life running from the consequences of his own choices. Jacob who wrestled with God in the dark, who wouldn't let go even when his hip was struck out of socket, who demanded a blessing before he would release his grip. Jacob, whose very name meant heel grabber, the one who holds on, and whose new name, Israel, meant the one who wrestled with God and prevailed, or the one whom God contended with. The interpretations vary. But the point is that the name Jacob is the name of a man who was always grabbing, always holding on, and the psalm says, God is the God of that man, the God who met him in his grabbing and wrestled with him and blessed him anyway. There's something in that, something that I think the sons of Korah would have felt in their bones, given their own family history. The God who is our fortress is the God of the grabbers, and the tricksters, and the rebels, and the families of rebels. Not because God overlooks what they've done, but because God's commitment to those he has chosen runs deeper than their failures. And the invitation to Rapha, to drop your hands, comes from that God, the one who already knows what's in your hands, who doesn't need you to pretend otherwise, who is saying, in the middle of the siege, in the middle of the nations raging and the earth shaking, just open them. I've got this. The geography of Psalm 46 is worth a moment, too. The psalm mentions a river whose streams make glad the city of God. And this has puzzled some readers because Jerusalem doesn't have a major river. The Jordan is a considerable distance away. What Jerusalem has is the Gihon Spring, a smaller water source that fed into the Siloam Tunnel that Hezekiah, remarkably, had constructed just before the Assyrian siege. The tunnel was dug through solid rock to bring water inside the city walls so that Jerusalem could survive a prolonged siege. You can still walk through it. The actual inscription that the workers left, celebrating the moment when the two teams digging from opposite ends finally broke through and met in the middle, was discovered in 1880. It's now in a museum in Istanbul. The cutting through solid rock in darkness, guided only by the sound of each other's hammering, until finally the wall between them gave way and the water flowed. Some scholars see in the river of verse 4 a reference not to a literal river, but to the tradition of a cosmic river, the waters of creation from which all life flows, the source that keeps the city of God alive even when everything around it is hostile and dry. The desert is all around Jerusalem. It is not a naturally lush place, and yet here is a river, here are streams, making the city glad. The word for glad is the same word used in the Psalms for the joy of worship, the joy that isn't contingent on circumstances, but comes from somewhere deeper. And those streams flow in the city where God dwells, in the city that will not be moved, not because of its own strength or its military preparation. Though Hezekiah did prepare, the tunnel is real evidence of that, but because of whose presence fills it. Here's something I think about when I read this psalm in the larger arc of the scriptures. The image of a city where God dwells, a city with a river whose streams bring life, appears at the very beginning of everything and at the very end of everything. In Genesis, in the garden, 4 rivers flow out from the single source, the water of life given to the garden where God walked in the cool of the evening. In Revelation, in the New Jerusalem, the city that comes down out of heaven, there is a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. And in between those 2 poles, at the center of the Hebrew Scriptures, in the poetry of the sons of Korah, there is a city that has a river, and God is in the midst of her, and she will not be moved. The Scriptures are not a collection of unrelated stories and poems and laws and letters. They are a single long conversation, a single long argument, building toward something. And Psalm 46 is not a small part of that conversation. It sits in the middle of it, holding together the memory of what God has already done, and the hope of what God will yet do, and calling people in the present moment, in the middle of whatever siege they're living through, to the same thing it called the people of Jerusalem to do. Rapha, drop your hands. Know that I am God. Not, know that things will be fine. Not, know that the danger isn't real. Not, know that your situation is going to resolve the way you want it to. Know that I am God. The word for God in verse 10 is Elohim, the broad name, the one that encompasses the totality of what God is, the powerful one, the Almighty, the one who was there before everything else was there. Know that I, this one, this uncontainable one, this one who commands armies and breaks bows and burns chariots and causes desolations, I am God. And not just in Jerusalem, not just for Israel, among the nations, in the earth. The declaration isn't parochial. It isn't for one group only. It stretches out to the edges of everything. I will be exalted in all the earth. And this is where the loop that opened at the beginning starts to close. Because the question was, what are we supposed to be letting go of when God says, Rapha? And I think the answer is more specific than just fear. And it's more specific than just the desire for control, though it includes both. What we're being asked to let go of is the conviction that we are the ones who have to make this work, that the outcome depends on the quality of our grip, that if we hold on tight enough, if we think clearly enough, if we plan well enough, if we argue persuasively enough, we can guarantee what comes next. That's the fist that God is asking us to open. Not our love, not our effort, not our responsibility, but the white-knuckled certainty that we are in charge of the result. Because the psalm is very clear about what God has done without our help. He makes wars cease. He breaks the bow. He shatters the spear. He burns the chariots. The verbs are all his. They're not ours. We didn't end the war. We didn't break the weapons. We didn't burn the chariots. We stood on the walls, and we didn't answer. And the morning came, and the camp was empty. And we sang the refrain, "The Lord of armies is with us." I want to be honest about something here. There's a reading of this psalm that can feel like a kind of spiritual passivity, like the idea is just, do nothing, and God will handle it. And I don't think that's what the psalm is after. Hezekiah built the tunnel. He prepared the city. He consulted the prophet. He mourned and prayed and spread the letter on the floor of the temple. He didn't sit on his throne and do nothing while the enemy gathered outside. The stillness that the psalm is after isn't the stillness of disengagement. It's the stillness of trust. You do what's yours to do, and you release what isn't yours to control. And the hardest part of that, always, is figuring out the line between the two. But maybe that's the right place to land. Maybe the wisdom of Rapha isn't a formula you apply once and resolve. Maybe it's a practice, a daily returning to open hands, a daily choice, in the middle of whatever siege you're currently under, whatever the Assyrian camp outside your specific walls looks like right now, to do what's yours to do and release what isn't, to take the letter and lay it before God, to say, I've seen this, I don't know how to handle this, but you do. The sons of Korah sang this, the descendants of a man who grabbed for something that wasn't his, who held on when he should have let go, who lost everything in the holding. And they wrote a psalm about releasing, about the God who is our fortress, about the river that runs even through a city in the desert, about the morning when God shows up, right at dawn, when the danger is greatest and the camp is empty, and the mountains are still, and the refrain rises one more time in the early light. The Lord of armies is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And then verse 10 again. Rapha, let it go. Know who I am. You've said those words your whole life. Be still and know that I am God. And maybe you've heard them as an invitation to a quieter spirit, a calmer morning, a smoother life. And those things aren't wrong to want. But the word is older than that. It comes from a place where the walls were real, and the armies were outside them, and the people of Jerusalem were standing on the ramparts, saying nothing, while the enemy voice echoed in the street below. It comes from a place of actual siege, real fear, real stakes, and right into the middle of all of that, the God of Jacob, the God of the grabbers and the tricksters and the families of rebels, said, open your hands, not because it's easy, not because nothing bad can happen, but because the one who commands the armies of heaven is the one making the request. And he has been exalted among the nations before, and he will be again. Rapha. And no, the knowing doesn't come before the releasing. It comes after. Or maybe it comes in the same moment. The open hand and the recognition, arriving together, that the one you're releasing your grip to has never once let go of you. That's the psalm. That's what those 6 English words have been carrying all along, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. Be still and know that I am God. Drop what you're holding. Open your hands. And in the space that opens, in the quiet that isn't the absence of noise, but the presence of trust, know. Let the knowing come, the God of Jacob, the Lord of armies, the river in the dry city, the morning after the long night, still here, still holding, still God.